Hello, scholars. It is wonderful to be with you again. And we are back to look at applied linguistics and learn a little bit more about dialectology. If you've been following along, chapter 18 was a really good place for us to start because it discussed regional dialects. And then in chapter 19, we're going to turn our attention to social dialects. I want you to go to the resources that I've already provided for you in the module. I've given you the headers. You take the header, you go to pages and click it. There it is, okay? Now, when we look at social dialects, we're going to move from the rural area where we just were when we were looking at regional dialects, and we're going to move into the social and urban centers. The urban centers seem to have like a lot more movement of people, more people coming into urban centers. There's, a more dynamic flow, for example, of folks who come and go. So the study of social variation or social dialectology is actually a little bit different from where we just were with the more rural environment. And it's not better and it's not worse, it's just different. So as we're looking at sociolinguistics, if you have my book, I'm going to be starting on page 283. I hope you have your study guide. The very first definition that we get from sociolinguistics is actually on page 283. It's the speech community. And all of us live and work and associate within speech communities. And right from the book, it's a group of people who share a set of norms and expectations regarding the use of language. So that definition says that we tend to prefer to associate with people who kind of have the same values that we hold as it relates to the language that we use. And still on that page, there is actually social relevance for folks within a particular speech community, and we call this the socially relevant aspect. We call this sociolinguistics. So what are the aspects of expressing ourselves in a particular way that are socially and culturally important to our speech communities? On 284, sociolinguistics is in bold print. So turn the page, we'll take a look at that. Right from the book, it's that nexus of how language is used in society. How do social groups, how do social communities, how do speech groups, how do speech communities use their language to really express themselves within their groups and even outside of their groups? So in chapter 18, regional dialectology was concerned with the rural environment. And now in chapter 19, we're moving to the urban environment. Social dialects and social dialectology has been concerned with the study of the urban centers. So we're not going to be referencing the quote-unquote norms group anymore. We're going to find that we're looking at different social study of dialects. The social class is mainly used to define groups of speakers as having something in common. So reading right from your book, the two main groups are generally identified as quote-unquote middle class, those who have more years of education and perform non-manual work, and quote-unquote working class, those who have fewer years of education and perform manual work of some kind. So there's actually an economic basis to the study of sociolinguistics. So your social dialect is known as a sociolect. It's based on some kind of economic basis. I'll just let that sink in for a moment. So from a sociolinguistic perspective, pronunciation is a big deal in terms of social dialects. And there are words and structures that are used by these two groups, these two economic groups, the so-called middle class and the so-called working class. They have certain grammatical structures as well as vocabulary that seems to be used more frequently in terms of word count and structural sentence count, with some groups in terms of, are they middle class or are they working class? So these variables, you can count, and people do this. Like, I don't do this, but there are linguists who do this. How often speakers that you wanted to kind of see how often the middle class speakers used it and how often the working class speakers used it. And that would be your word count or phrase count to check on that linguistic variability. Now, looking pronunciation, words, and structures. Okay, just trying to follow along with your study guide here. Idiolect and sociolect. Idiolect at the top of 285. The idiolect is defined. It's in the bold print. So I want you to take a look at 285 up at the top. That is your personal dialect. And quite frankly, we tend to sound like others who have the same occupation that we have. For example, if all of us are medical doctors, then we kind of sound like other medical doctors. And if all of us are first responders, we kind of sound like first responders who also have that same occupation. So that's all that means. And when we become adults, the outcome of the time, quoting from the book, in the educational system is usually reflected in the occupation and socioeconomic status. So that's used by other engineers, and you sound like an engineer because that's who you associate with. Social markers start on page 286. Now, linguistically, the variability in the way that we speak is due in part to either having a feature occur in your speech or not having a feature occur in your speech. This helps to serve as a social marker because it says to others who are listening to you that you're part of a particular social group. If you have terminology that is particular to a group, then it's assumed that you are part of that group. Now, in this second paragraph on page 286, they give you some examples that I think are worth looking at. I think this book is fabulous. So let's take a look at this. The pronunciation of ing can sometimes be heard as ing, like thinking, and sometimes be heard as in, like thinkin'. These are just variations, but they also serve as speech markers and social markers so that we end up assuming, correctly or incorrectly, that the ing indicates more of a quote-unquote middle class economic status, where the in indicates, we think, more of a quote unquote working class indicator. Maybe true, may not be true. I don't know. Grammatical features are also found in terms of word counts and grammar counts. Over on page 287, the so-called speech style says that every person seems to speak in a particular way. And this is, again, a social feature of how we express ourselves. In our last chapter, we talked about, if you were going in to meet with the dean, you would probably have one way of speaking. And if you were with your friends, when you have a meeting at work, you're probably more formal than you are, in terms of your language use, than you are when you're just hanging out with your friends and just kind of relaxing. This is all considered to be completely fine. It is part of your speech style, but it's good to know that if you're with your friends, your speech style can be over here, and if you're in a big important meeting, your speech style might be over here. So informal, formal, and you can shift between the two depending on the circumstances. So you can actually change your use of language from formal once you leave that meeting and you go meet your friends to informal, because now you're with your friends. A change from one style to another style is called style shifting. That seems almost not difficult, right? So you have style shifting going on. Now, there is something that I need you to know about style shifting. You should be on page 287. Look at the second paragraph, and then go to the very, very, very last sentence of the second paragraph. In a finding that has been confirmed in other studies, and here it comes, because this is the part that I want you to hear. I'm going to say it probably twice just to make sure you hear it. Middle-class speakers are much more likely to shift their style of speaking significantly in the direction of the upper middle class when they're using a careful style. Oh, think about that. So, middle-class speakers are much more likely to shift their style of speaking significantly in the direction of upper middle class, not super wealthy, but upper middle class. And there's a distinction between, the 1% and all the rest of us. And so this speaking significantly in the direction of the upper middle class when they're being careful. And there are some reasons for this. First of all, if you consider yourself to be a middle class speaker and you're shifting into upper middle class style, then you figure you can pull that off. You know the terminology, you know the mannerisms, you kind of know what you're doing. But if you try to shift into the style of the super wealthy, you may sound pretentious and you may sound like you don't know what you're doing. So, the overt effort on your part to try to sound intelligently, highly educated, and then just get this nice big, oh, I'm so wealthy going on too, you're probably not there. Neither am I. So when speakers, I'm in like the fourth paragraph, speakers in a middle class group try to use a quote unquote prestige form associated with a higher group form, higher status group, they have a tendency to overuse the form. And it's a hypercorrection. And they can't pull it off. Neither can I. So the shift is from middle class to upper middle class. I really seem to go beyond that. Now, this brings us to the concept of prestige, language prestige. And if you go resources, you will see tons of articles on prestige. I think it's so important that we understand what this means. The concept of a quote unquote prestige form is really in depth covered on page 288. And it talks about like preference, language preference, that it's that belief that a particular way of style or style of speaking has higher prestige than another way. And this is actually a taught and learned behavior because language is language. Language works for you. You know, if it's working for you, then it's probably fine. But prestige is further divided into overt and covert. Now, overt prestige is where a person, a speaker, will attempt to shift into a way of speaking that the general community embraces as covert prestige, however, is a little bit different. And that is that it's more of a lateral shift in that the person, the speaker, is attempting to make their language fit with the group where they feel the most comfortable. And they do not attempt to shift into a higher prestige, quote, quote, unquote, language style. So the covert prestige provides status to the speaker by welcoming the speaker into a group that may or may not have social prestige to this in the same way or to the same effect that some of the other groups have. Now, if you go to the portal, you're going to see all kinds of articles, including one that I think is really relevant for teachers of English learners. First of all, there is a lesson plan in there that you can tap into. It's free share, and it talks about language prestige, and it gives you a video, and the students can hear the different accents and see who's discriminated against based on their accent. And then the other one is why does the brain not really respond favorably at times to quote unquote foreign accents? So it kind of goes in depth into that. If we as teachers recognize the way that we may have been acculturated to understand language and the way that we might affix prestige to a language and not affix it to another, then we better understand in a way I think that's more helpful to us as educators. Then we have this understanding that the English learner is coming into the classroom sometimes with a quote unquote foreign accent, which may make them the subject of bullying in the classroom. It's something that teachers have to be incredibly aware of. And if you know more about your own thoughts on quote unquote foreign accents, then I think it makes you better able to, go into your classroom and be prepared and ready to work with your learners to diminish and eradicate biases that they may have that they just don't even realize that they have as it relates to foreign accents. Now, also on page 288, we have something called speech accommodation. So it's our ability as a speaker to modify or change the way that we speak so that our audience can keep up with us and so that we can keep up with them. It's an exchange of sorts so that we're all on the same page and we're all able to be together in terms of our language. Now, as we work with English learners, we may see something called convergence, which is an effort on the speaker's part to diminish social distance. And when we do that, we try to make our language come over and better meet the language of the English learner. And we do that as teachers because we want the English learner to succeed. On page 289, there's a different concept called divergence. Divergence meaning to separate or diverge. And this is sometimes seen in classroom situations where you may have a student who is acting in a particular way, demonstrating a particular behavior that is considered to be disruptive that day in the classroom. And you may have to put social distance between yourself and that student. And this is often done through language so that your language diverges away from that of the student. Looking at today is register. And register is a conventionalized way of using language in a particular situation. And I think that we're all familiar with it, but we haven't really probably thought about it much because we're so accustomed to it. But register, you know, when you go to, the book gives you these examples. When you go to work, you have a particular way of speaking that you may not use at home. When you go to the dentist, you have a particular way of speaking that you may not use at home. And if you are in like a funeral, for example, you have a way of speaking that you would reserve, you know, for funerals, a certain way of expressing yourself to the people who are mourning. So these are all considered to be examples of register work. So if you've ever had to go to the doctor or another healthcare professional, you probably heard some healthcare terminology, the medical jargon. And as teachers, boom, so much jargon. It's almost overwhelming, the amount of jargon that teachers have. Same thing for engineers, same thing for your planners, same thing for your first responders. So that jargon is the work-related language that is, you know, affixed to that particular occupation. Slang is typically used by those who are, that's used quite often among younger people. Slang comes easily into a culture away and is replaced by new slang, which also comes in easily and drifts away. So slang is not terminology that is always destined to become part of the broader spectrum of the language that is used by the bigger population of people living in a country. Taboo terms are those 4-letter words, occasionally 5 letters in English, that we don't want English learners to incorporate. And I want you to think about this for a moment. If you hear an English learner, that little young one comes in and they suddenly drop a 4-letter word in front of you, think for a moment, you know, they may not know what that means. They heard it somewhere and they don't know what it means. It's a new word. And in an effort to impress you, they use it. So please gently think to yourself, does the learner actually know what this means? Give them the benefit of the doubt if you can. And maybe substitute for them. Help them to find another word that they can use instead of that taboo term, okay? Now, also in chapter 19 is African American English. I'm reading from page 291. If you go to chapter 19, you will see resources for different dialects, and this is the reason. African American English is a variety used by many, not all, African Americans in many different regions of the U.S. And because there have been so many social barriers to success, then speakers of African American English have not always found the success that they have, in fact, earned. Prestige. So that folks who hold more political power or more economic power in a culture may decide that a particular dialect is lacking in prestige. African American English has often been assigned low prestige, which again is something that is not an earned signature, but is one that is a stereotype and a form of bias. Now, one instance or one understanding of African American English is the vernacular. And these local versions constitute a kind of social dialect, and they are considered to have a number of features such as other varieties or dialects, including reading from the book, so-called Chicano English, spoken in some Hispanic American communities. Still reading from the book on page 291. Varieties of what has been called Asian American English are also characterized by pronunciation features of the vernacular. Again, if you go to resources, you'll find more information about all three of these topics and all three of these vernaculars. I think it's important to know that the concept of prestige has been used against these vernaculars and many others, typically by the group holding the dominant power in a culture. One that is not included in our textbook that I would like to include with that list would be the grouping of Native American or First Persons languages, which also have held traditionally low prestige, again, as a result of bias against these languages. On 292, the sounds of a vernacular include the reduction of final consonant clusters. And the different grammars of vernaculars can include, interestingly, can include forms of Old English and can also include substrates from some of the Romance languages, like where you find a double negative. You would see a double negative in French, which has two parts of the negative, one in front of the verb, one after the verb. And we can see a detrimental to us for folks to decide that there's something quote unquote wrong with a language simply because it is a way of expressing oneself. That certainly is not what I believe. And it's not what I want you to believe. I don't want you to go into your classroom and just assume and just decide that the way that a student is speaking is, quote, wrong. It's true, we're all speaking a commonly shared language, and then it's also true that there are many varieties of that language. So as you continue reading on 292, 293, as well as the multiple resources on the portal, I hope that you'll consider how language use within the classroom, within your classroom, can really propel a student forward, can take an English learner from being, that silent child in the classroom to being an active participant in your classroom. I want you to think about that, and not be the teacher who is actually um, holding a bias against a student just because of the way they speak. And I think that's really why chapter 19 is so important to us, whether it's a student who is learning English, an English learner, or whether it's a student who has spoken English their whole life. Okay? So much to think about. And thank you for joining me, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.